Hello, I'm Dr. John Cruz, and today I'm going to be talking about ADHD and perfectionism. So I'll be talking for about 20 minutes. If you have questions So I'm talking about ADHD and perfectionism. I'm Dr. John Cruz. If you have questions while I'm talking, you can type them in. This will also be posted on Facebook and YouTube. So to start with defining, most researchers and psychiatrists define perfectionism as straining compulsively for unattainable goals, for being in a flawless, devoid of any errors or mistakes state. And closely connected with that striving is that people who display this perfectionism tend to measure their self-worth by their productivity or their accomplishments. So what they do, what they produce is very closely tied to how they see themselves, and connected with that is there's a very strong connection with harsh self-criticism. There's been some debate over the years whether there's such separable entity as positive, healthy perfectionism, those that encourages striving and working hard and working towards a goal, versus the negative perfectionism, which may be more tied in with the insecurity, the negative self-views, the negative self-assessment. But most research has found that whether you're initially defining it as positive or negative, both of them seem, particularly when perfection is not achieved, and it isn't achievable for humans, that both forms or all perfectionism seems to be connected with depression, with anxiety, and actually one of the strongest connections is with suicidal events. Other strong connections with perfectionism are eating disorders, narcissistic and other personality disorders, and many people also lump OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder, strongly with perfectionism. Right now, for decades in psychiatry, we've actually identified two different conditions. So we have what's called an obsessive compulsive disorder, which is characterized either by obsessions or compulsions, where someone's either internally ruminating on the same thing, or engaging in behaviors like checking locks or counting or tapping their fingers rhythmically in a compulsive way. And there's a separate, related but separate concept called obsessive compulsive personality disorder. That's much more closely connected with perfectionism per se. So what does any of this have to do with ADHD? Doesn't on the surface it seem to be almost the opposite? Aren't people with ADHD the ones crashing into other people, blurting things out, procrastinating, turning things on late, forgetting to turn things in? One of the cardinal 9 inattentive symptoms listed in DSM-5, and I think it's actually the first one, is making careless mistakes tied to inattention. One would think, isn't that just the opposite of ADHD? Well, as a matter of fact, what we find is that at least 30% of people with ADHD have symptoms somewhere in the OCD spectrum. And a recent study found that the number one cognitive distortion connected with adults with ADHD, the most commonest problem they were running into and was causing dysfunction in their lives, was perfectionism. That's work, by the way, by Russell Ramsey, who's done a lot of cognitive behavioral assessment and work and plans helping people with ADHD. So why would there be this connection between ADHD and perfectionism when they seem so different? Part of it, as with absolutely everything else in mental health, is that all of our syndromes, problems, disorders, things we're working with or helping people with are products of both nature and nurture. So there is some genetic influence over perfectionism. It's certainly not a simple perfectionist gene, you get it or you don't. And there are genetic contributions certainly to ADHD. Maybe it's that some people are predisposed towards having both of those things. There's some evidence for that. Even if there's some evidence for that, again, it's only a partial answer, because there's clearly nurturing, environmental, psychological, interpersonal effects which seem to be strengthen the likelihood someone's going to wind up with a perfectionistic tendencies. And the psychological literature links strong parental or other important adult figure criticisms, so that the person develops that the developing child develops a sense that they are not good enough, and then that they're striving to make up for that, compensate for that, redress that, results in them being more obsessively focused on getting everything right, doing everything perfectly to please others, and eventually developing pleasing themselves as they need to get things absolutely right. The research also fairly substantively shows that even though this may be a logical approach to that problem of feeling rejected, is that it's a pretty ineffective one. And again, it's ineffective because nobody can be perfect, and then therefore the failures, imperfection, and the obsessive striving on that is actually pulling people away from interactions and is making it more likely they're going to feel disconnected and rejected from others. So it doesn't work too well. So again, the central flaw or problem with perfectionism, and I usually say there are 6 or 7 perfect people on this planet. And I say it that way because people stop and pause and say, wait a minute, no, there's nobody perfect. It's such a trite saying, so overused, so banal, when you say nobody's perfect, that if you start out with that, people aren't even listening to you any longer. It just goes over your head. So I pretend there's 6 or 7 perfect people to get you to think and remember and process a little more deeply that nobody is perfect. This can't be a winning strategy. That doesn't mean there isn't good value or reasons to strive or work hard. So why might people with ADHD be particularly vexed with this perfectionism? Again, some of what we were talking about, separate from any biological factors, people with ADHD are probably in childhood making more mistakes. They're missing more social cues. They're getting things wrong in more social settings. They are making more errors from simple not checking their mistakes, not catching their process. So their own ADD behavior may drive them or push them towards a perfectionist direction for that reason. Another reason ADHD and perfectionism get entwined is because people with ADHD often have trouble initiating tasks because they are so easily distracted, because it's harder to muster the motivation to do something that requires effort and sustained effort particularly. And so that the way perfectionism gets tied in with that is people with ADHD often feel things have to line up perfectly. I have to be in the right mood. I have to have my desk completely cleared. I have to go clean the house before I can possibly answer this email or do something else. And then they get overly evolved in their task. So that leads to a third way that ADHD and perfectionism intertwine, is the lack of control over focus, so that people can get not just distracted but hyper-focused. Once they get into doing something in a perfectionistic way, they may be overly unable to extract themselves before they pursue things to what they perceive the possible end is. They just are so immersed, so unable to get out of it, that meshes well with perfectionistic tendencies. Getting back to initiating tasks, if they fail to start a task, then they may feel blocked, they may feel thwarted, they may feel ruminating obsessively again, which again further prevents them from starting the task. And because ADHD in about 2/3 of people is associated with emotional dysregulation, when someone with ADHD is frustrated, doesn't have initial success or progress of the task, they're much more likely to get really frustrated, really blocked, really upset, unable to progress or move forward because of that. So some people's conception is, well, if there's a genetic component, perfectionism is part of your personality, and we know personalities can't change. We actually have lots of evidence that many different therapeutic approaches, and this is more focusing on psychotherapies rather than medications, that cognitive behavioral therapy, we have studies there that changing how you become aware of your own cognitive errors and can correct them, that how you change your thinking, how you change your behaviors can change your feeling state, can reduce your degree of perfectionism. We know that interpersonal therapies can also effectively reduce perfectionism, and that makes sense if an important central early element of developing perfectionism is imagining rejection if you're not going to do something perfectly, and learning that you may be okay as you are, or you don't have to be perfect to be accepted. I would call it a branch of CBT, but exposure response therapy, where just basically encourages people to go ahead and try it and challenge their belief that this isn't going to be good enough, I'm going to fail if I turn in this math homework that isn't perfect, and having them turn it in and realizing, no, the response to people around you wasn't that you failed. You might have gotten a B or a C, not an A, but you weren't rejected, you didn't. And acceptance-based therapy, which may be akin to some of the interpersonal therapies, but learning, people can learn to accept their lack of imperfection and to deal with life as it is rather than with the life we would want it to attain. So all of these 4 different psychotherapeutic approaches have been shown to be helpful in the long run with reducing perfectionism. So my sort of tools or approaches for helping specifically people with ADHD, one is starting out with realistic goals. So often people with ADHD jump in before thinking deeply or knowing the whole terrain, and they may adopt an unrealistic goal. I'm going to do this homework assignment tonight, even though it was supposed to take me 2 weeks, or I can accomplish some elaborate project in some unrealistic amount of time, or I volunteered for 17 different committees in the parent-teacher conference because those all seemed interesting, exciting, important, and I forgot that I actually have a job and 2 kids of my own at home to take care of. So part of it is learning to pause before you jump in and set a goal for yourself. This is one of the places actually having a calendar and a schedule actually helps, because even if when you volunteered or took on a task, you might not have paused to think, there's at least another opportunity to pause and think and reassess whether it's realistic when you're writing or putting it into your calendar. So 2 other things. Many people with ADHD may not even be adept at assessing whether their goals are realistic or not, so reminding them that it's okay to get help or advice or recommendations from others, or bounce it off them to say, is it really reasonable to do this all tonight? Or is it really feasible to be on 6 different committees, or X, Y, or Z? So you are allowed to get help, you're allowed to revise your initial plans, you're allowed to think a little more deeply over whether your own goals are realistic ones. And again, introducing flexibility into what's realistic is a part of what helps people out of perfectionism. A second sort of target of work with perfectionism is what I was talking about before, is getting through the notion that nobody's perfect. And again, almost everyone will say, yeah, I know it, but I should do X, Y, or Z, or I should be able to do these 7 things, or I should be able to accomplish this by yesterday. So part of the work of de-escalating perfectionism is working on breaking down all or none thinking and learning that almost every task can be performed on a spectrum, that's not completely bad or completely perfect, that almost everything has some degree of good, very good, and there's some things that you need to get right. I mean, if you are driving your car, you need to be in the right lane. The correct lane, the proper lane. You can't go down the highway if you're in America on the left side of the road, because you're going to be running into oncoming traffic. So I'm not saying that everything is graded on a scale. Some things you do need to get right. But the problem with perfectionism that many people create many situations in their mind where they need to get it completely right or it's no good at all. So that sort of blurs into one of the common other framings, and that is that perfect is often the enemy of the good. And I also, a different framing of this concept, or a slightly different concept, and I have another video in this series that was done many months ago called Task Not Test. What happens is that people are viewing this performance, this homework, this committee assignment, this project is a test. They will do it right or they will fail. And if you step back and ask yourself, wait a minute, what am I really trying to accomplish? What is my goal here? What is my, how does this tie in with what I see my life being about? Very seldom does that, the only solution to that being passing this test or getting 100% or making this music composition exactly perfect. And if you are so mired in your perfectionism you're not completing a task, then you're not producing anything. I mean, almost anything can be revised, improved upon, made better, but if you have nothing out there, nothing for the teacher to grade, nothing for no project or work for the boss on the computer coding project, or no work done on your committee assignment, then there's nothing there to work from for others. So, or to build your own reputation. So learning when to cut off the sort of perfectionist tendency to tie down every last detail, get everything exactly lined up, and decide this is good enough for this goal right now, and that this is in line with my further lifetime task. I don't have to make it a test. Somewhat related to this, and this is again the work of Russell Ramsey, who's a cognitive behavioral therapist, and some of their work has shown that one of the most, I was going to say deadly, but dysfunctional and trapping aspects of perfectionism with ADHD is the mindset that the conditions have to be perfect for me before I can start to do this task. So often in therapy or with their session or on their own, the person will come up with, I will work from 3 to 4 o'clock on this project, and then 3 o'clock comes around and maybe they started at 3:02 because they were distracted by a videotape, or they had to move their car, X, Y, or Z, and then they're already thinking, oh my God, I should have an hour to do this, and I don't have my full hour, and besides, I'm not really well rested, I'm not ready, I'm not in the mood, and then the conclusion is, I can't do it. And ADD therapists and work in some ways have fed into this by telling people, you have ADHD, you are more prone to distraction, you are more prone to get off track. You need to eliminate your distraction. You need to have things perfect or more perfect for an optimal setting for you to get work done. So we have to find ways to not throw out that idea completely, but to back off a little and to acknowledge, yes, it is harder for you. You may face more obstacles. You may be more tempted to get off track. You may be delayed a little, but getting started, working on it is going to be more productive than waiting for that perfect moment. I mean, I'll use sports metaphors. Even LeBron James or in basketball or Tom Brady in football, they don't feel ready to practice every single practice session. Even the experts, even the perfect people in the world in their activity aren't always primed optimally, but they put the work in. They go ahead and do it, knowing that when they can identify some of, if there are distractions, you can try to minimize them. If you need to do other things to improve your situation, but waiting till it's optimized and it's perfectly ready to go is part of the perfectionism that's going to get in your way of doing anything. So the task is to make, when you're using your schedule, when you're using your task lists, to make your tasks doable, not make it, set it up so that everything has to be perfect before you can go forward. So I hope some of that was clear. I see that there is a message, so I will read it and respond to that in a minute. I guess I'll do that right now. So the question or comment says, I find myself not recognizing my perfectionism most of the time. Often I fail at something or I'm forced to reflect. Do I realize what I've done? So any advice to how to realize that you're in the midst of or being waylaid by your perfectionism? And again, that's one of the things I touched on earlier. One of the easier ways is if you are in the habit of using a calendar and scheduling. When you're putting things on the calendar, that's again an additional chance to pause to sort of reflect, is this really reasonable to schedule for this amount of time? And even if initially you don't, if you learn over time that you're not scheduling enough time to do that, then you're going to be getting feedback from your calendaring scheduling system. And the schedule is always a tool. It's not something itself to be perfectionistic about. So I'd say the other, related to calendaring, anytime you are starting work on the task, you may have, should be an opportunity to assess, again, in a task versus test way, what is it that I'm actually trying to accomplish in this amount of time? Is that really realistic for me to do? If I think it's realistic, do I actually have concrete examples of doing a similar amount of tasks, a similar amount of work in the same amount of time? And it's important to use yourself as a reference there, because if you're thinking, oh, your favorite novelist can churn out 300 pages of text in 6 months of working on their book, so I should be able to do 3 pages of good prose tonight. That's probably not a realistic assumption. Or if your sales partner over there who's been working 3 years can close 4 deals in a day, if you're new at this, you're probably not going to be at the same speed. So part of the realism is not asking whether it's possible for anybody, but asking yourself, with my amount of training, with my experience, with my intelligence and other social skills, does this make sense for me to try to do right now? And again, you won't be perfect at assessing whether your goals are realism. The goal isn't to be perfect at it. The goal is to get better with time. So I hope I've answered that. So there's another question. This makes me think also about boundaries and not overcommitting my time or energy. So that's a good point again, and again, why, even though there's lots of resistance and rebellion against it, and I do have other sessions in this series about scheduling and using your calendar and using it as a tool, not as a cudgel to beat yourself over the head with. Part of the value of a calendar is learning what's realistic. If you're perpetually thinking, I can type up all my reports at the end of the day in 20 minutes and be home, and you schedule 20 minutes, and then you can see from your calendar, wait a minute, I'm always blowing past that. That gives you feedback over how much time it's taking you to do that task. And it should train you to say, I need to either make that task a smaller one or schedule more time for it. So yes, overcommitment is certainly a propensity that many people with ADHD have, because their enthusiasm, their interest, their desire propels them to jump into more than they've been able to assess whether they're able to do. And I would say, though, given that most people on the planet accept my contention that there's only 7 perfect people, you are always allowed to revise or tell the boss, I volunteered for this, or I thought this would be done yesterday. The boss is almost always happier. He may not be happy, but happier to know, okay, this isn't going to arrive tomorrow, it will be in 2 days, or 3/4 of it will arrive tomorrow, than to wait till tomorrow and either have nothing turned in and still stewing, or have an incomplete thing turned in at the last moment. People, you are allowed to reassess, reapprise others of your progress, and almost always, even again, if in the moment they're not happy with it, they will be happier learning it then than learning at the deadline or after the deadline has passed. So that's all I'm going to say for today. Next week's topic is going to be about ADHD and trace minerals, so copper, zinc, magnesium. I know there's a lot of buzz And what I'm aware of so far is the actual data in science is pretty limited on their effect, but I won't prejudge the matter. That's what I'll be talking about next week. So have a safe and healthy, happy week, and I will see you next Friday at 11.